I'm Mrs. Madden, the first grade teacher, and today I'm going to read to you Moosetache by Margie Palatini and illustrated by Henry Cole. Moosetache had a problem. A horrible, hairy, prickly problem. It grew right below his nostrils and just above his upper lip. A moustache. Now, not a few spare hairs or shy little stubble. No, a mere weak wandering whiskers on the upper lip of this moose. No siree, Moose had a big, bushy, bristly, mighty moustache. But a moustache that was burly, surly, magny mess, and it itched a lot. Sure, he plucked and he tweezed, he even clipped and snipped and teased, but his combs were still cowards, and his brushes rebelled. His scissors simply surrendered. Moose was in a frizzy-tizzy. The moustache was completely crimping his style. He was a great hoofer, but he could barely bop and hip-hop with a moustache going flip-flop. He was a wonderful chef, but he simply could not famble his souffle with all those whiskers in his way. He was a daring skier, but how could he get downhill race with the mighty moustache blowing in his face? Moose had to do something. And soon. But what? After days and days of much serious thought, Moose got an idea. He crossed some hair here and he crossed some hair there, and he tied his moustache around his neck. A moose scarf seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. But then his moustache got knotted and mangled and horribly tangled, and those hundreds of hairs still prickled and tickled. Worse, Moose could barely take a breath with all of that moustache wrapped around his neck. So, moustache untied, unwrapped, unknotted, and gulped in some fresh air. He got another idea. He parted some hair this way and he parted some hair that way, and he heaped all of that moustache on top of his head. Moustachitoed antlers seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. Until a squadron of squirrels and one very noisy gopher moved right on in to Moose Motel. They huddled and hoarded and furrowed in and burrowed out. Needless to say, it became quite crowded up there on Moose's head, and heavy and messy. And very, very noisy. The squirrely chit-chatting, squeals and squawks woke Moose every morning before the crack of dawn, and that gopher was giving the moose one hairy headache. Moose needed his sleep. He needed his rest. He needed his privacy. Moustachitoed antlers? Nuts, said Moose. So he unparted, unpiled, untwisted, and untwined, and said, adios to those hairy horns. But now what? What? The miserable moose took a whole hunk of hair and rustled it and then roped it and tethered and tied and tamed. A moose tail. Now that was so simple. That was so easy. That was not so perfectly perfect. Talk about a dizzy do. Moose didn't know if he was coming or going, backward or forward, this way or that. He didn't know which end was which. Moose had to bail on the tail. And so he thought, and he thought, And he thought some more, but no other idea was a worthy winner. Braids were a bother, a moustache sweater, too sweltering. Net? Not. Poor Moose, his problem was truly terrible, unbearable, just downright sad. He felt so alone. He didn't know what else to do. Then, call it fate, call it destiny. It was probably dumb luck. But one day, Moose tripped on his moustache and just had no time to duck. Oomph! Pardon me, they both said as they bumped and they blinked and they stared, and their hearts went thump-a-bump. She was a moose, with a bouffage so bodeous, outrageous. Well, it was just plain old big. Hair after hair piled higher than high, a skyscraping dew of glorious curls, a tower of swirling twists and twirls. She was simply splendid, stupendous, absolutely superb. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did to get such a do. Miss Moose winked and then whispered, "Just a little glue." So, she helped he fearlessly plunge a hoof into a fat pot of white gooey goop, and carefully, oh so carefully, they glopped and they plopped, they pasted and they pressed, they coaxed and curled every truly unruly wayward whisker. Around and around they tweaked and they twirled those horrible hairs until Moose's one magny mess was now a wondrous winding wave of marvelous moustache. Moose gazed in the mirror and smiled a broad moosey smile. He was so happy, so glad, just giddy with glee. He looked dashing and handsome. Moose gushed, "Is that really me?" With not a care for one hair, the moose pair boogied and bopped. They skied downhill, even uphill, and their cooking was hot, hot, hot. So, of course, it wasn't long after that Moose and his moustache and his beautiful bride fox-trotted and tangoed and waltzed down the aisle. Good hair days, bad hair days, they vowed to love and cherish. And with heaps and heaps of love and pots filled of goop, they both sighed, "I do glue," and promised to never part. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect, and it just stuck.